Okay, so I want to discuss a different framework for discussing genetics, genealogy, and that type of thing. Because I feel like the current framework is not the most ideal framework when talking about genetics. I believe this rainbow framework is a lot more easier and more sensible to use. For example, let's take the term sub-Saharan Africans. Okay, we try to use that as a proxy for this cluster of genetic populations, let's say. Okay, or to say cluster of genetic patterns. But that term is not very sensible. First of all, it's always going to be an issue labeling genes and genetic patterns and genetic clusters with socio-political concepts. Okay, these made-up territorial boundaries, essentially. Okay, and right, one issue is the sort of political sort of connotations with that. Sometimes you'll see people kind of have friction over someone being labeled with a certain country or something like that. But then it's not the best sort of approach because these territorial boundaries are constantly shifting, right? Like, Spain and Portugal used to be essentially one country, but the boundaries are always shifting, these countries are always shifting, and then genes are always changing. But not just that, populations can move into that boundary and they can move out of that boundary, but we fix this boundary to that genetic pattern. It really doesn't make much sense. Like with sub-Saharan Africans. So technically, someone like Charlize Theron or Elon Musk are within this framework are sub-Saharan Africans. If they're South Africa's in sub-Saharan Africa, and we call them South Africans, which means they're sub-Saharan Africans. But we're fixing that term. Yet we're using that term to try to identify these other sort of populations in a sense. It doesn't really make sense. Or the fact that these populations that we are, or even these populations' historical originators, they have they've lived in the Sahara and they live above the Sahara, but you're calling them sub-Saharan Africans. Okay, and then there's even the thing where recent immigrants into this so-called sub-Saharan Africa would be sub-Saharan Africans, right? We'll call someone a recent immigrant to Ireland an Irish person. So wouldn't that be the case? It's not just like this people with Afrikaner sort of origins, right? They have hundreds of years of roots in the region of South Africa, so they technically should be sub-Saharan Africans. But not just that; it's a very sort of there's this frozen flattening thing that's happening, right? I already feel like sub-Saharan Africans is basically like this sort of flat, frozen caricature, anyways, right? You're going to have these stereotypes and assumptions when you think sub-Saharan African, but there is just something inherently flattening about these current terms. What I mean is like imagine this so-called sub-Saharan African. You're going to there's so much sort of genetic admixture in these so-called sub-Saharan Africans, but then we just call them sub-Saharan Africans. It kind of doesn't make sense. Okay, um, right? You're kind of omitting their multiple genetic and cultural origins. Okay, it's just kind of ahistorical as well. But then it's still that sort of stereotype aspect. There's some people who, you know, there's people with long historical lineages in Africa. They have fairly lighter skin, for example, like some San tribals, for example, who do have sort of admixed origins, but then we just call them sub-Saharan Africans. It just kind of doesn't make sense. Another example of this that kind of pushed me more towards considering different sort of frameworks to talk about genetics is I come across someone was doing a study on Irish people. That's what the title was, like genetic study on Irish people. Which Irish people? Again, like within this framework, recent immigrants are Irish. Are you talking about them? Are you including them? Though we also have a sense that what this sort of caricature or stereotype they're referring to when they're saying Irish, but we shouldn't be having to assume and speculate and juggle these different things. But even within that, are you talking about the Shelta people? Because wouldn't that skew that genetic test? Because they are a distinct genetic, even though they're sort of similar to the average Irish person genetically, they are still genetically distinct. Are you including them? Are you not including them? Are you including this test on Irish people? Are you including someone with like a grandparent from someone who has like deep origins in Britain, Anglo-Britain populations? Is that included in that Irish? What about someone with a more distinct genetic subfrequency? Like maybe one of their parents has deep Yoruba origins, right? Are they included in Irish? What about someone with more remote originators from somewhere else? You know what I'm trying to say? Like, these labels are not really making sense when talking about genetics. Really, I would say they were talking about at least genetically red Irish inhabitants. Okay? So that's where this rainbow framework sort of comes in, right? That's just easier to talk about. You're saying genetically red Irish people because there's genetically yellow Irish people. There's genetically purple Irish people, and henceforth and that forth. Okay. And when you're saying sub-Saharan African, you're kind of really meaning genetically violet people. Okay. So with this, or people with a lot of genetically violet people, because they could have different color origins, but basically I feel like using color, right, it avoids this sort of socio-political issue, and then it's just other reasons it's more sensible to talk about it. Okay. Like another issue is like I have an issue with the term like and concepts like Native American or indigenous. Like I'm sorry, but like George Bush is Native American. Like Native American should be this open fluid concept. It doesn't really make sense, nor does indigenous. Like if you have George Bush is indigenous American because they have 400 years of roots there, right? People become indigenous to a place. Indigenous just basically means long-term inhabitant, but then we're using it as almost this proxy for these genetic populations or clusters. It doesn't really make sense, and even to the point where like there's populations that originate from people who migrated here like 12,000 years ago, genetically green people, right? Genetically yellow people migrated from Asia and they shifted into genetically green people, but just 4,000 years ago, more genetically yellow people migrated into the North America, and they're still genetically yellow. But then you're treating two distinct genetic color people. You're treating two colors as one genetic population. Just because some population are sort of treating them as like the relevancy of it all or something like that, but you label them all indigenous American when they're two distinct colors, two distinct cultures. Like it doesn't really make any sense. Okay, so yeah, there's people with there were ancient, basically there was ancient green Americans and there was ancient yellow Americans as well. Okay, so it doesn't make sense to call them indigenous or native or anything like that. And then they just have problematic connotations. There's just a strong casteist vibe. I'm not gonna call people native, indigenous, or aboriginal. I mean, first of all, those populations seem very sort of territorial with that, and then other populate that's not how the world works. In other populations, it just seems dehumanizing. There's like a casteist connotation to these terms. Everyone's indigenous, so why don't we say indigenous British commonly? Something's off there. Okay, it's treating people like wildlife or like zoo animals or something. So to avoid all of this, it's just more sensible to use color. And then it's like genes can work very similar to color, which I feel like it aligns very well, right? So genes are just genetic differences are just genes at different frequencies. Different colors are just light at different frequencies. Okay. Like one way to talk about this is that sort of, I don't know, this little beef that people talk about. Like, some people are like, some black cultists are like, everyone defends from Africans type of things, when not really. It's more like, so there was these, first of all, we all originate from this other colored population. But then, yes, that population shifted into, let's say, genetically violet people. And, like, those populations went somewhere else, they shifted to another color, and then from that color, all these other colors shifted out of that. But it's the same thing. If you change the frequency of red, you can get orange. Did orange descend from red? No, that's the same thing. No one descended from these people. The frequency of the genes just shifted, right? But that's another issue with like sort of genealogy. It's put through this sort of hierarchical linear filter, and that's not how genes work either. It's not hierarchical, and it's not linear. It's more like, we can almost imagine like radiating like a misty, cloudy sun, right? And they're radiating. That's what it's more like. It's more silical. It's like, I don't say I descend from someone. I originate from them. Like, it's not this hierarchical thing. We just sort of diffuse from each other. Okay. But to break down this color thing more is right. So red, these are sort of basically ancient West Eurasian associated populations. Okay? Because, and it's just an association, it's just a correlation, because that's another thing. We're fixing these made up territorial boundaries, these continents, to these fluid genetic patterns and clusters, when it's just association. Yes, so race isn't real, right? It's not like, if an elf was real and a Navi was real, like from Avatar, there would be an elf gene pool and a Navi gene pool. There's no white gene pool or black gene pool. There's just a Gaian gene pool, a Gaian people gene pool. But yes, this gene pool can be, there's these different concentration of genes which sort of reflect as these sort of distinct genetic sub-frequencies, I guess you could say, which we can use as colors in like the same way, right? But because there wasn't sort of mass transit, yes, these genetic concentrations sort of were able to develop, so we can associate them loosely with places, because people can move around, so they're not fixed, and people can move into those places. So, but roughly in ancient, we can get these colors, right? Associated loosely with, or just associated with ancient West Eurasia, red. Okay? Like, what's a popular genetically red person? George Bush, genetically red. Okay? Elon Musk, genetically red, probably has a bit of colors from other places, right? Okay. But also other populations, like, you know, what's that person who, I don't know, he has like big old eyes. But anyways, genetically red. Orange, um, that's like ancient South India associated populations, genetically orange. Mindy Kaling, Aziz Ansari, probably genetically orange, though they probably have significant amount of genetically red people, right? So people migrated into India, shifted into like orange people, I guess you could say, and then genetically red people migrated into India, and there was some admixture there. Okay, but genetically yellow people, ancient-ish East Asian, Southeast Asian associated populations. Okay, so genetically yellow people, right? Lucy Liu, uh, populations like that, right? Because it doesn't make sense to say like this super equation because there's admixture again, there's movement and that type of thing, right? There's a lot of in Southeast Asia. There's a lot of people who have genetically blue genes, right? For example, but red, orange, yellow, green. That's ancient North American associated populations, right? Genetically yellow people migrated into the Americas and they shifted into genetically green people, genetically green, okay? Though, again, there was a genetically yellow historical presence there for thousands of years there as well. Blue, ancient Polynesian-ish associated populations, including people in Australia, ancient Australians, right? Genetically blue. And then genetically violet, ancient Africa associated populations. Okay? And those are basically the colors. Like I would say I'm genetically purple, okay? Because red mixed with violet is purple, but I'm mostly genetically violet with a significant amount of, well, I would say I'm genetically rainbow. I have little bits of basically each color, but I'm mostly genetically violet with a significant amount of genetically red. Okay. Yeah. So that's another thing. So those are the colors. Those are the frameworks. I think that's a more sensible way. Sub-Saharan African, genetically purple Africans. So, and that's another thing. This is like sometimes I want to be specific, where I'm saying like genetically African inhabitants, because then there's the contextual issue, and I don't want to get any objectifying, dehumanizing vibes. I just think it's kind of off to call people like that person is African, like calling someone a continent. I don't know, it just seems off to me. But in certain contexts, maybe it's okay. But purple Africans, but there's also red Africans. They have long historical presences, like in what we call North Africa. There's been genetically red people there for thousands and thousands of years. So, like that's another thing. Like Africans, like using it as a synonym. I feel like that's so much omission and erasure there. Like using African as a synonym for genetically purple people isn't cool just because of the majority there. Like so, there's other colors that have historical presences in Africa, and then even a recent immigrant to Africa has this, at least metaphorically, I guess, has this are African in a sense. But, anyways, there's that thing as well. Okay, so again, context. I'm not saying this isn't. First of all, it's in the context of genetics. I'm not advocating that we're saying there's those two yellow people like as a replacement for anything, or just using it generally. Like those yellow people, no, they're violet, this or that. It's in the context of talking about genetics. And then there's some people like there were some people. I remember someone got fired because they said call some people yellow, and it's like, I mean, that was kind of hypocritical. Like, they literally came out with a song. They made a song. There's a Coldplay song called Yellow, and they made that song in Crazy Rich Asians playing off that. So I don't see how you can call yourself yellow, but then you get mad when other people call you yellow. But that's the thing. It's like, I would kind of reconsider that if a lot of genetically yellow people stopped calling people white and black. Like, why can you call some people a color, but we can't call you a color? Okay, and that's another thing with like white and black. So we've used colors like this before, but it's just nonsensical how we only use it for apply it to these two sort of, I don't know, I guess theoretical populations, and it doesn't make sense because there's no, it's so binary. Like, there, I mean, this is it's just binary, and then it's just correlated with appearance. Like, I've never seen someone with white skin or black skin, but then it's also just binary. There's, so we're saying red, orange, yellow, but there's shades, right? I'm not saying violet African inhabitants. There's shades of violet. There's shades of red. There's shades of orange, and those are sort of associated with different cultures and tribes, right? And locations. But, and I guess we could even, I mean, that's another story, but, right, there's shades of red, right? Like, what's that guy? Um, what's his name? Mr. Robot. Like, Rami Malik is red, genetically red, but they're like a different shade of red from, like, say, George Bush. Okay. And then I'll still call people genetically red if they have a bit of different genetic origins, because technically you could still be red anyways. Like, if you say you are like 90% genetically red and like 10% genetically like blue, that would still make red, you know what I'm saying? But still, I'm not omitting people's sort of full origins. But yeah, that type of thing. There's these different shades, but yeah, rainbow framework. Hoping for some feedback. I think it's a more sensible way to talk about genetics. It sort of breaks down a lot of issues with these terms and concepts and that type of thing. And the current form is very confusing. It can be very confusing when you're talking about people and just like different things. I just think that's a general thing with things like people who are still talking about like the genetics of Vikings, even though that was discovered. It's more was, I don't think it was just a profession. It was still like, it was a culture, but still it was just a culture. Different people, different colors of people were Vikings, but it's just sort of been fixed like as if they were just genetically red. No, other colors and that mixtures were Vikings. So, but maybe that's what people want to talk about, but it would be red Vikings. You know what I'm saying? There is something to say about red Vikings, but just to saying like the genetics of Vikings, this and that, it's like it doesn't really make much sense. Okay.